Good afternoon. We are going to be ready to start in about 2 minutes, so if you could find your seats, that would be amazing. Text your friends and tell them the round is getting ready to start. Good afternoon and welcome to the 2022 Lincoln Douglas Value Debate Final Round. I am super excited to introduce you to our affirmative debater this afternoon. Her name is Miss Julia Stacy. And to our negative debater, Miss Alina Rodriguez. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce our prestigious panel of judges. First, Ms. Patience Griswold. Patience is an alumna of Bethlehem College and Seminary and the Colson Fellows Program. She's been involved with Minnesota Family Council's LEAD program, leadership training in the real world, for nearly a decade. Prior to this, Patience taught logic, history, literature, and debate at a classical school. She competed in NCFCA in both styles of debate and multiple speech categories. Welcome to our panel this afternoon, Ms. Griswold. Next, we have Mrs. Leah Horton. Mrs. Horton is currently a third-year Master's of Education student at Covenant College. Leah homeschooled for 18 years and served on the board of Legacy of Christ, a speech and debate club in Florida. She's also taught debate. For the last 7 years, she's been the owner of Horton Test Prep. Her children were actively involved in the league for a total of 12 years. So welcome back, Mrs. Horton. Next, we have Mr. David Jakubowski. Mr. Jakubowski has a bachelor's degree in sociology, math, and electrical engineering, and master's degrees in electrical engineering, engineering management, and systems management, and a doctorate of management in technology and information systems. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on the topic of innovation. He has 30-plus years of government service for the U.S. Navy. Thank you for that service, Mr. Jakubowski. He is currently the Deputy Assistant Program Manager in Systems Engineering for the Tomahawk cruise missile. The most important thing that I want to share with you, because it's important to us as an NCFCA family, is that Mr. Jakubowski was one of 3 community judges that were recognized as Community Judge of the Year last year, and now, in total, over the last 2 years, Mr. Jakubowski has judged a total of 130 rounds for us. Next, we have Mr. Lewis Culsack. Mr. Culsack has a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering from Purdue University. He has an MBA from the University of Chicago. Lewis was also a high school team policy debater. He's then spent the next 25-plus years in business and management consulting and currently serves as a strategy consultant and advisor for small business owners and mid-sized businesses. Lewis and his wife, Hillary, have been involved with NCFCA for 10 years. He's a team policy coach with his club, and we are very pleased to have you on our panel this afternoon, Mr. Culsack. Next, we have Dr. Cora Liebig. Dr. Liebig has a bachelor's and master's degree in chemical engineering from MIT and a PhD from the University of California. She's an inventor on more than 25 U.S. patents. Dr. Liebig is the founder and CEO of Chromatic 3D Materials, a startup company developing technology for industrial implementation of 3D printing. Cora and her husband Michael have 4 children who have been NCFCA competitors over the last 10 years. Welcome to our panel this afternoon, Dr. Liebig. Next, we have Mr. Eric Mishni. Mr. Mishni is a bachelor's degree in theater from Cedarville University and master's degree in interpersonal communications and rhetoric and public culture. He has 22 years of speech and debate experience as a competitor, judge, and coach. Eric is the Director of Forensics at Cedarville University and Professor of Communications. Eric is married to Natalie and has been a foster parent to 3 young children. He competed in NCFCA in the league's early years in the mid-2000s, not 200s. You're very old, Mr. Mishni. Eric shared with me just before the round that he competed in his first nationals in 2003 in the final round. Not in the final round. All right. But he was here at his first nationals in 2003, and this is his first one back, and he's pleased to be on our panel. So welcome this afternoon. Finally, we have Dr. Ravi Paul. Dr. Paul has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and a PhD in management from Clemson University. He's a professor and department chair in the College of Business at East Carolina University. He's an NCFCA parent. He serves on the NCFCA board and is the chair of our debate committee. Welcome to our panel this afternoon, Dr. Paul. Attendees, I would ask that you all remain in your seats at the end of the round in order for our judges to be escorted out. You all have a wonderful round.
Ever since March 2020, every country around the world has personally experienced a drastic slowdown in their economy. Even after 2 years, we're still facing the impacts of this crisis every single day. I believe it's imperative that we work to ensure our economy is being protected, which is why I affirm today's debate resolution, that in the context of innovation, the proactionary principle ought to be prioritized above the precautionary principle. Why? Because proaction promotes the people. Let's first kick off today's debate round by better understanding the terms that we're discussing, starting with the definition of innovation. Innovation is defined by the digital intent as, quote, innovation is the process of creating value by applying novel solutions to meaningful problems, unquote. Second, we're going to be looking at our two principles, starting with the proactionary principle, which was defined by Max Moore, who's the philosopher and developer of the proactionary principle, where he states that, quote, the proactionary principle is the proactive pursuit of progress. Being proactive not only involves anticipating before you act, but also learning by acting. It evaluates risk according to available science and not popular perception, unquote. Lastly, we have the precautionary principle, which was defined by the World Commission of Ethics in Scientific Knowledge and Technology, where it states that, quote, when human activities may lead to morally unacceptable harm, that is scientifically plausible but uncertain, action shall be taken to avoid or diminish that harm, unquote. The precautionary principle can directly halt progression for civilization. This can be paralyzing to our societies, which is why I believe the value or the end goal of today's debate round should be that of quality of life. Again, quality of life. It's not enough just to be alive, which is why a majority of successful economies measure the quality of life of their citizens. This includes not only the ability to live and breathe, but other factors like the ability to prosper and succeed within your own community. The way we're going to be achieving this value is with a tool or a criterion of economic development. Again, economic development. Economic development is defined as those activities that lead to a greater resource productivity and a wider range of real choice for consumers and producers. Now, we use economic development to achieve quality of life because innovating more goods provides more trade. More trade grants economical growth and lower cost of goods, both crucial elements for optimal living standards. Argument number one, proactive innovation boosts quality of life. Proactive innovation boosts quality of life. One of the largest boosts to our economy has come from the creation of the digital world. An annual Booz & Company report on the world's most innovative companies revealed that 9 out of the top 10 most innovative companies were founded right here in the United States, companies such as Apple, Google, and Amazon. But why is that significant? Well, the United States has long prioritized having proactionary principles for the internet by giving its innovators few restrictions. For example, in 1996, the White House signed an act that protects against having regulations on digital innovation. This act continues to be upheld. Subpoint B, quality of life is fueled by economic development. Again, quality of life is fueled by economic development. In order to protect and progress the lives of their citizens, a nation must first have the means to do so. History continues to prove to us that economic development directly provides us for those means. For example, we can look at the idea of forced child labor. Poverty is the most contributing factor to child labor. To combat this, a study in Vietnam found that when Vietnam raised their GDP by just 9%, it directly correlated to their child labor decreasing by 30%. Argument number two, unmeasurable restrictions harm. Unmeasurable restrictions harm. Productivity losses mean more scarce resources going into fewer goods and fewer services, a process that is both unsustainable from an environmental and an economic perspective, and this is proven in two subpoints. Subpoint A, prioritizing precaution hinders growth. Prioritizing precaution hinders growth. The precautionary principle is often summarized as better safe than sorry, but where are the limits to chasing that safety? The precautionary principle could logically apply to every conceivable activity. since their outcomes are always, in a sense, uncertain. David Murray, the Director of Statistical Assessment Service in Washington, D.C., points out the reality of the negative principle. Anybody who merely raises threats of harm with no more evidence than their fearful imagination gets to and then invoke on precautionary measures. However, that does not mean the affirmative side is innovation without any oversight. As we see in subpoint B, cautions remain present. Cautions remain present. Now, I'm not advocating for totally free and unchecked innovation. Supervision is great, but just because precautionary principles are present does not mean they need to be prioritized. For example, if I wanted to invent a new type of car for the public, there's a particular type of testing that is legally required to be done regardless of which principle we prioritize. Because it is impossible to make progress by sitting in chairs and thinking carefully, the advancement and sustainment of life requires the proactionary principle to be prioritized.
This will be a 3-minute period of cross-examination if all my judges are ready. Should people be held accountable to an external standard?
You mean a standard that's set by one of the principles?
To some kind of external standard that can be elaborated under a principle, but just as a general rule?
Sure. If it's a moral standard, then I would agree.
Okay, so is it morally acceptable to innovate for profit?
It would depend on what that innovation is. If it cost the lives of human beings, then not so.
However, if it cost the lives of human beings but still generated wealth, would this still fall under the category of economic prosperity?
It would fall into the category of economic prosperity. However, economic prosperity was not my value. It was the tool to achieve quality of life.
But again, if that is the tool to achieve quality of life, both principles have to clearly link to economic prosperity, correct?
Correct.
In order for you to win the round, correct?
Correct.
Okay, but wealth producing can still fall into the realm of economic prosperity, right?
Correct.
All right, so let's move on and look a little more. Is quality of life intrinsically moral?
It is not intrinsically moral. However, I'm sure we can all agree that the advancement and sustainment of human life is a fundamental morally thing.
So human life, is that distinguishable from the ability to enjoy a good life?
It is. For example, I can survive by eating breadcrumbs. However, am I having a good life? Obviously not, which is why people eat 3 meals a day.
So how does a society measure quality of life?
So we actually have measures of quality of life that are already embedded in not just our own society, but broadly. For example, the CDC has a set measurement in place that's called Happy Days, which distinctly lays out 5 different qualities. But we can also look at the fact that countries yearly put out an index that distinctly describes the quality of life and those particular aspects.
But again, I'm asking, why does the quality of life specifically matter? Does it matter because life is intrinsically valuable, or because quality of life as a holistic principle is intrinsically valuable?
Because it matters, because it's not enough just to sustain life. Also, in context of today's debate resolution and context of innovation, innovation is made to advance life, not just sustain it.
Again, this is is that an ought question, or is that an ought statement, or is that what it actually does?
Referring back to my definition of innovation, using innovation to solve problems in the real world, I would consider that is an ought question, considering it is moral to solve problems in the real world.
And within today's round, would you agree that we need to look at both the oughts and then the practical realities of what is?
Sure.
All right. What is available science according to your definition offered by Dr. Max Moore?
Available science is anything that we know is going to happen, or particularly available scientific data.
So regulations are only warranted under the Proactionary Principle when we look at what we know is going to happen?
Correct. Or if there's severe or probability or high risk.
How do we evaluate what kind of action we take in a situation of plausibility?
In a situation of plausibility,
Sure.
if it's not a known harm, and if the benefits outweigh the cost, then we would pursue the progress of that production, of the innovation.
And why is it not productive to consider plausibilities?
Because when we're looking at instances, again, referring back to my definition of innovation, where we need to use innovation to solve meaningful problems in the world, when we apply cost-benefit analysis, it's more important that we focus on the risks that we know are going to happen.
All right, thanks for your time. Looks like I'm out. I'm going to go ahead and start. If all my judges are ready, then I will begin. As Thomas Paine once said, a body of men holding themselves accountable to nobody ought not to be trusted by anybody. Within the realm of cross-examination, my opponent and I established that it is essential to have an external standard for accountability. And when we boil this resolution down to its basic premises and look at innovation in this context, we see that we're really asking the question today, what is our starting point when it comes to innovation? To answer this question, I look back at the ancient Greek text, that of the Hippocratic Oath, which states, "First, do no harm." Join me as I negate the resolution, resolved in the context of innovation, the proactionary principle ought not to be valued above the precautionary principle. I agree with the framework that my opponent presented. However, I do want to offer one clarification and elaboration from the World Commission of Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology, which my opponent used to define the precautionary principle. And I agree. However, later on within her contentions, she appeared to display the precautionary principle as one that does not have apportioned measures. And this is a dangerous standard to hold, because the precautionary principle does not simply impose a one-size-fits-all mentality. We see specifically that it, quote, actions should be chosen that are proportional to the seriousness of potential harm, with the consideration of their positive and negative consequences, and with an assessment of the moral implications of both action and inaction, end quote. What we see from this definition is that we have both proportionality and consideration of the principle. The principle does this within innovation, and it does not exclude innovation from within the market. This is essential to hold when we look at what we are valuing within today's round, which is why I move on to one response to her value. Quality of life, she defined roughly as the advancement of a society's citizens, and my singular response is that of contextual. Contextual. As we developed this in cross-examination, we really saw that what my opponent was valuing was that of the sanctity of human life, but the measurement of prosperity within quality of life that she offered was merely contextual to the beneficence of its citizens, which is why I propose the counter value of human rights, fundamental human rights. The reason to prefer this is because it's clear, measurable, and specific. It's clear in that philosopher John Locke offers us a moral framework clearly linking to innovation. Now, John Locke offers the moral framework that of life, liberty, and property, which is proper in any innovation framework. And the reason is because innovation is, in fact, a process. Although we have advanced as a society and continually progressed, fundamental human rights have not changed and have not ceased to elaborate, have not ceased to flow over the ages, and we need to continue to protect these in any process that we establish today. It is also measurable insofar as that we can measure a clear violation to human rights, versus it is difficult to measure whether quality of life is not being upheld within a given context of innovation. And finally, it's specific in that we have a moral duty to protect fundamental human rights, as opposed to the lack of moral framework that we see with my opponent's criterion, which leads me to my next response, that of lacking moral framework, lacking a moral framework. Economic development does not specifically link to the quality of life because it is merely a tool used to achieve an end. It can just as easily be utilized for danger. We see that in 1980, the Supreme Court granted scientists a patent to be able to receive any kind of monetary benefit as a result of their manufacturing. We see this created this dual incentive for innovators. They can operate for profit and accumulate wealth within the context of this resolution. However, they can also use their innovations to benefit society. We need to take into account this dual standard that we have given innovators under the context of innovation in order to be able to give us the principle that both clearly establishes the duty to enhance life, but also to protect it. This leads me to two contentions today, wherein I will respond to the core of my opponent's case and also continue to elaborate my own side of the resolution. Beginning with contention one, the proactionary principle fails this moral framework. The proactionary principle fails this moral framework. And the moral framework that I specifically laid out in today's round was that of fundamental human rights. My first response is to this idea of cautions remaining present, and that's looking all the way back to her definition of when regulations are warranted under the proactionary principle. And that is, again, she stated, only when a known and proven threat occurs. That is the only situation wherein we regulate. And this leads me to subpoint one, that of a subjective bright line, a subjective bright line. The danger with this kind of mentality is that if we leave innovators to determine what constitutes a known and proven threat, they are permitted to not take the starting point of first evaluating all the results, but rather innovating and moving forward until those harms occur. This is a dangerous standard to hold, as seen through my illustration of this point, that of Vioxx. Now, Vioxx is a shorter name for rifaxicob, which was introduced by Merck in 1999 as an effective and safer alternative to non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs used to target osteoarthritis. However, it was subsequently found after it was released to increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, and as a result, it had to be withdrawn from the worldwide market. And now Merck faced 30,000 legal claims from people who had either suffered cardiovascular events while taking the drug or other debilitating life circumstances. The reason this occurred within the given situation is because Merck only knew that rifaxicob might increase thrombus formation, but none of the studies that were conducted actually looked at the plausible harms. You see, within the realm of today's round, my opponent has left one major question, and that is, why should we avoid plausibility? It is my contention that plausibility is essential to address under the context of this resolution, with innovation being the introduction of novelty, which leads me to contention 2. The precautionary principle protects human rights. The precautionary principle protects it protects human rights. And we see this first through the point of innovator accountability. Innovator accountability is paramount within the field of innovation because, as Dr. Bernard Goldstein wrote, quote, "At its core, the precautionary principle contains a focus on primary prevention and a recognition that unforeseen and unwanted consequences of human activities are not unusual," end quote. So here we see the starting point to innovation is that of first do no harm. But the reason this is essential, and this is in response to this idea of the precautionary principle imposing unmeasurable restrictions, is that it is specific. According to the Journal of Responsible Innovation, quote, "Rather than stifling research and innovation, the precautionary principle acts as a focus for action, in that it calls for the development of risk methodologies, the execution of risk research, and the active identification of knowledge gaps," end quote. It is because uncertainties matter within today's round and we must assess them that I negate the resolution. Thank you.
What is the purpose of innovation?
The purpose of innovation is dependent on the intent of the innovator.
Now, you'd agree with me that essentially the purpose of why we innovate, though, is to advance human life, correct?
If you're asking an ought question, then I believe, yes, the purpose of innovation ought to be to enhance life. But I believe we need to look at what ought and what is within today's round.
But the majority of innovations that we put out in the world are innovations that advance human life. Is that correct?
Again, advance human life insofar as that this is an ought versus what is question. If you mean advancing human life as in giving people monetary benefit, then they can do so.
No.
But I don't want to equivocate this use of the word advance.
But I'm not specifically asking of what the purpose of an innovator is, but what the purpose of innovation is. You'd agree
Right.
with me, the purpose that we have innovation is to advance human life, correct?
Again, advancing human life is a subjective term. It can be used to promote our own dignity, but it can also be used to gain monetary benefit, both of which could be advancing human life, but it is essential to differentiate what we're arguing for in today's round.
All right. Now, what degree of certainty in regards to risk is enough to satisfy the precautionary actors?
So again, the precautionary actors, the precautionary principle in uncertainty specifically calls for the identification of knowledge gaps, and as I pointed out earlier, prescribes precautions that are proportionate to the harms that are observed.
All right. Now, you would agree with me that scientific data is valuable, correct?
Scientific data, yes, is valuable.
And you would agree with me that we didn't obtain scientific data on innovations like airplanes until we actually started using airplanes and then collecting data. Is that correct?
No, we began researching before we built airplanes.
All right. You would agree with me, however, the scientific data that we do have on innovations is only because we actually use the innovations in real life, correct?
We use innovations through our research that we've gathered.
But until we actually use those innovations, all that scientific evidence is simply scientific plausibilities, correct?
So again, we have the scientific plausibilities and the identification of knowledge gaps in order to determine what this plausibility's consequence will be.
All right, now let's say, hypothetically, I have 3 kids. In order to feed these kids, I would first need money to buy food, correct?
Yes, you would.
And it's the same way for our nations. In order to best protect and sustain the lives of our citizens, they must first have a prospering economy, correct?
Again, yes, they must, but this is one side of the coin. And this is also a major extrapolation.
Now, would you agree with me that someone in a developed nation probably has a higher level of quality of life, or level of security of life than someone in an underdeveloped nation?
Not necessarily. We know that in high areas of economic prosperity, there is also rampant crime.
All right, and in order to grow our nation, we need to trade, correct?
Trade is essential, yes.
And in order to trade, we must have products that other countries desire, correct?
I mean, this is, again, non-unique to this idea of principles, but yes, that is true.
And
it is within the field of innovation.
Your
true.
value is of human rights, but you're specifically looking at just the human right of life, is that correct?
I'm looking at life, liberty, and property as I outlined within my speech.
All right, that's all the time I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Quote, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have just said faster horses. Unquote, Henry Ford. If we only ever listened to popular perception, innovators like Henry Ford would have never persisted in creating something that has evolved our society and increased our quality of life far beyond what we could have ever imagined. A proactive pursuit of progress far outweighs the stagnation from popular perception when it comes to innovation that is critical for the advancement and the sustainment of our society. With this being said, I'm going to be going down the flow and addressing the points that Alina brought up in her last speech. Specifically, she began talking about the idea of the World Commission's definition of the precautionary principle. She gave the statement that the precautionary principle addresses the morality in situations and makes decisions based on the proportionality. My first response you can tag as the default. Again, the default. Just because the precautionary principle can assess the fact of the proportionality does not mean that it necessarily acts on it. Why? Because the default position of the precautionary principle is always going to be to resist innovation until there is no uncertainties or no problems. Where the default of the proactionary principle is going to be pursuing progress, and that's the conflict in today's debate round. My second response you can tag as the distinction. Again, the distinction. What is the conflict between our two terms? The distinction is what risk that we are specifically dealing with. Subpoint A you can tag as precaution equals plausible. Again, precaution equals plausible. The precautionary principle is focusing its sole attention not on known risks that we know are going to happen, but risks that are scientifically plausible. What exactly does it mean? Merriam-Webster defines the term plausible as, quote, superficially fair, reasonable, but often having a false look of truth, unquote. So what does that mean in context to our principles? Well, this would mean like me walking outside and an airplane falling from the sky and crashing on me. Scientifically, that checks out. I can walk and airplanes can fall and crash. But is that scientifically probable? Of course not. That leads me to subpoint B. Proaction equals probable. Again, proaction equals probable. The risks that the proactionary principle is specifically focusing on are risks that are scientifically probable, the ones we know are going to happen. Merriam-Webster defines probability as, quote, the strong likelihood or chance of something happening, unquote. This would be like me walking out into an open field during a hurricane and getting struck by lightning. We should rather focus our attention on risks that we know are going to happen rather than scientific plausibility. Why? Because hypotheticals are endless. We're never fully going to be able to satisfy those hypotheticals until and release an innovation under the precautionary principle. Furthermore, my opponent talked about her counter-value of human rights. To this, I have 3 responses. My first you can tag as quality of life equals measurable. Again, quality of life equals measurable. My opponent made the contention in her last speech that we can only measure human rights and not quality of life. However, this is simply not true. I gave the example of Happy Days, a quantification of what quality of life entails and how we measure those annually. We also see that we have reports online where each country distinctively notes the qualities of quality of life and can measure them. Quality of life is measurable. My second response you can tag as sustain versus advance. Again, sustain versus advance. Now, I agree with my opponent that life is an important thing. However, is it better to sustain life or advance life? I brought up the example as I can sustain my own life by surviving off breadcrumbs. However, that is not upholding my quality of life, and that's not something that we should simply prioritize in today's debate round. My last response you can tag as quality of life equals life plus. Again, quality of life equals life plus. I agree that life is a great thing. However, we should not only be focusing on sustaining life, but advancing it, and that is what quality of life is all about. Secondly, she talked about in her first contention how the proactionary principle needs a moral framework. My one response again, hypotheticals are endless. Hypotheticals are endless. I agree, morality is an important thing, but we should focus on the risks that we know are going to happen.
If all my judges are ready, then I will begin. Should we value uncertainties within the context of innovation? This was a question I posed within my negative constructive, and I believe it is because it is paramount to have a standard for addressing those uncertainties in order to ensure that we have an adequate and acceptable moral framework that I continue to stand resolved and negate the resolution. Let's do so through some points of analysis and rebuttal, and then crystallize the main contentions of this round through 3 key reasons. I want to begin by looking at the first rebuttal point, and that is the of uncertainty is a valid moral context. Uncertainty leaves us with a valid moral context. This uncertainty paradigm is central within today's round because my opponent was looking and breaking this uncertainty paradigm into 2 points, that of plausibility and probability. However, the problem with the way my opponent broke this down is first that she did not define plausibility according to the consistency standards of the World Commission of Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology, but second, that she didn't offer us a clear way the proactionary principle valued uncertainty within the scientific process. Again, we simply acted according to known threats in her definition. So let's begin with this first idea, that of a mischaracterization. And this was again by the World Commission of Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology, which she said the precautionary principle takes action against these scientifically plausible but uncertain harms, wherein it goes on to say that plausibility should be, quote, grounded in scientific analysis, end quote. So what we see here is that this plausibility standard that is given is one that is grounded with scientific analysis that is consistent with the definition I pro-offered of those development of risk methodologies. So it's again not just halting innovation within any given circumstance, but it gives us a clear standard by which we approach innovation, and that is looking at the unknown side effects. This is what we did in the case of Vioxx, and it was essential to address this in order to prevent any violation of life and to ensure that innovators had a moral reason to be innovating, to use their liberty and to use their property for this end. This leads me to my second response, which is that of no standard to address. No standard to address under the proactionary principle. And I already briefly touched on this, but you have heard my stance on it, and my opponent has not given us a reason or rebutted this example of why we should not be addressing uncertainty in the proactionary principle. This leads me to again, a value response, which is that of contextual. Quality of life may in fact be measurable, but it is not contextual within the standard of today's round. Or it is rather, quality of life is a contextual value in the standard of today's round. Because quality of life, as my opponent defined it and gave it the quality through her criterion of economic development, we see that quality of life is again subject to the interpretation of what advancement looks like and what beneficence looks like. And this is not an unacceptable moral framework to hold if we're going to look at intrinsic value within today's round, which leads me to my final response in terms of the value. Fundamental rights are non-contextual. Fundamental rights are non-contextual. Even as we as a society continue to progress, we still see that fundamental rights have not changed, even if our definitions of what advancement and progress looks like, even if our definitions of what true human flourishing has looked like has changed, fundamental human rights that outlined by John Locke, life, liberty, and property have not changed. And innovators still have a moral duty to use their liberty, to use their property in the just way to promote human life. This leads me to a final clarification when I respond to her ideas of sustaining and advancing, and that quality of life ensures that it's life plus, and that's my response of innovation occurs either way. Innovation occurs either way, and again, I elaborated on this back in my negative constructive, pointing out that precautionary measures are employed proportional to the observed harm. We are not stopping innovation, and in fact, the scientific analysis process is the innovative process, because the act of innovating involves research and involves the identification of knowledge gaps in order to move forward in the best possible way. The question isn't, are we going to move forward? It is, are we going to move forward in the best possible way? And this leads me to my voting issues, beginning with this idea of a moral duty to protect. A moral duty to protect. The reason we have this moral duty to preserve and protect fundamental human rights is because only through the protection of human rights can we actually see adequate sustaining and enhancement of life, which comes, or rather adequate sustaining and enhancement of life throughout the innovative process. This leads me to subpoint A, that of lacks warranted restrictions. Lacks warranted restrictions. The proactionary principle has given us no standard to address risks. It lacks the warranted restrictions because there's no reason to prefer innovation in a situation and prefer regulation in a situation where we have an unknown threat. We have not been given a clear standard when we should be regulating within the proactionary principle against uncertainty. And again, that is a problematic situation to find ourselves in. And my opponent has not given us a clear hierarchy for how we should do this, which leads me to my final subpoint, that of an accountability standard. An accountability standard. The precautionary principle within today's round has been given us a clear accountability standard and one that we should hold to within today's round. Because it first called for the development of risk methodologies, it was one that was proportional, and it was finally one that asked that first question, what is our starting point when it comes to innovation? That starting point of first, do no harm. It doesn't simply merely address hypotheticals as my opponent has claimed. Rather, it gives us clear, specific outcomes for the way we should address innovation, which is backed by philosophical thought according to John Stuart Mill, who states that, quote, the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively in and interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection, end quote. What we see within today's round is a clear moral framework within the innovative process, and one that best upholds human rights through this accountability standard. This is what we should be voting for under the precautionary principle to ensure that innovation is pursued in the best way.
Is there ever a point where we're prioritizing safety so much that it is becoming morally unacceptable? There is. It's when we're using the name of safety to deprive people of vital innovations that are necessary for not only the sustainment, but the advancement of their lives. And that's exactly what the precautionary principle is doing. In the last speech of today's debate round, we're going to be focusing our attention on 4 main voting issues, the topics that you should be looking at when making your decision at the end of today's debate round. My first voting issue you can tag as the precaution only works in hindsight. Again, precaution only works in hindsight. Alina gave many examples of why the precautionary principle is necessary because of things that have gone wrong in innovation processes. No, I recognize things have gone wrong in innovation processes. However, we only know things have gone wrong in hindsight. In the moment, we don't know what precautions we actually need to take place until we enact that in the real world. Furthermore, my second voting issue can tag as life is not enough. Again, life is not enough. Alina talked in her second point in her last speech that there's no standard to proaction. However, I've been talking about ever since my 1AR, how sustaining life is simply not enough, which was never addressed by the negative side. Why? Well, I could live off of breadcrumbs. I'm sustaining my life. However, is that good? Is that moral? Of course not. In context in today's debate resolution, we must be using innovation to advance and solve problems in the real world. Living off of breadcrumbs is the world the precautionary principle wants to grant you. That is immoral and that should not be prioritized. My third voting issue you can tag as precautionary principle fails quality of life. Again, the precautionary principle fails quality of life. Now that we've seen simply this idea of human rights is not enough and that we must prioritize first a value and a goal of quality of life, let's see why the negative side fails it. Alina talked about in her last speech how innovation occurs either way, and I can agree. But let's remember the burden on innovation that's placed under the negative side. We must solve for all these hypotheticals, scientific hypotheticals, before we can actually release an innovation. Now, Alina talked about how we should be using a scientific analysis. However, scientific analysis does not mean that it's not simply going to be a hypothetical still. For instance, in today's debate round, I could pass out, I could throw up, I could trip and break my leg. That is all scientifically plausible. Does that mean I should just walk off stage and not complete today's debate round? Of course not. But again, that's the world of innovation the precautionary principle wants you to prioritize. My fourth and final voting issue you can tag as quality of life requires proaction. Again, quality of life requires proaction. It is necessary that we focus our attention on using innovation to create economic development to sustain and advance human life. I talked about this in my first contention, which was not addressed by the negative side, and I talked about this in my second contention, which was not addressed by the negative side. This is very important because Apple, Google, and Amazon and 6 other companies use proactionary measures and thus built our economy. Thank you.